Take a moment and imagine the world without clothing. No jackets, no shoes, no hats, no gloves, no fabrics of any kind. Now imagine standing outside in the middle of winter. A freezing wind cuts across your skin. The temperature continues to drop, and there is nowhere to hide. For most modern people, surviving even a few hours in these conditions would be difficult. Yet somehow, our ancestors managed to survive for thousands of years in a world without modern clothing. How? And perhaps more importantly, when did humans first decide to cover themselves? Most people think they already know the answer. The story seems simple. Humans got cold. Humans made clothes. Problem solved. But history is rarely that straightforward, because when scientists began investigating the origins of clothing, they discovered something unexpected. The evidence wasn't hidden in ancient caves. It wasn't carved into stone, and it wasn't found alongside prehistoric tools. Instead, the clue came from a tiny creature that has lived alongside humans for thousands of years. A creature most people hate. Lice. Yes, lice. These tiny insects may hold the secret to one of humanity's greatest inventions, and what they reveal completely changes how we think about clothing. Tonight, we'll travel back hundreds of thousands of years, to a time before fashion, before textiles, before sewing, before civilization itself. We'll discover how early humans survived harsh climates, how animal skins transformed history, how the Ice Age changed everything, and why the real reason humans started wearing clothes may be far more surprising than you think, because clothing didn't simply change how humans looked. It changed where humans could live, how far humans could travel, and ultimately, how humans conquered the planet. For most of us, getting dressed is something we do without thinking. A shirt, a pair of pants, maybe a jacket. It's such a normal part of life that we rarely stop and ask a simple question. What was life like before clothes existed? To find the answer, we need to travel back hundreds of thousands of years, long before cities, long before farming, and long before anyone had ever stitched a piece of fabric together. At that time, human ancestors lived mainly in Africa. The climate in many regions was warm, making clothing unnecessary for survival. Unlike modern humans, our ancestors were also much hairier. Their bodies were covered with thick hair that provided natural protection from the sun and changing weather. In a way, nature had already given them a built-in coat. Life was difficult, but clothing was not a major concern. Every day focused on survival, finding food, avoiding predators, protecting family members, and adapting to an unpredictable world. Scientists believe that over time, humans gradually lost much of their body hair. Exactly why this happened is still debated. One theory suggests that less hair helped humans stay cooler while running long distances under the hot African sun. Humans developed an unusual ability compared to most animals. We became excellent endurance runners. Sweating helped cool the body. Less hair made sweating more effective. But every advantage comes with a cost. As humans lost their fur, they also lost protection. Protection from cold temperatures, protection from strong winds, and protection from harsh environments. For thousands of years, this wasn't a serious problem. because most humans still lived in warm climates. But eventually people began moving into new regions. They explored unfamiliar lands. Some traveled north into colder environments. Others crossed mountains and open plains. The farther they traveled, the more challenging the weather became. Fire helped keep people warm. Simple shelters provided some protection. But these solutions had limits. You couldn't carry a shelter everywhere, and a campfire couldn't protect you while traveling. Humans needed something better, something portable, something that could replace the protection their bodies had lost. Without realizing it, our ancestors were approaching one of the most important inventions in human history, an invention that would allow humans to survive in places that once seemed impossible: clothing. But surprisingly, the earliest clue about clothing doesn't come from ancient garments. It comes from a tiny creature that has lived alongside humans for thousands of years. A creature most people never want to find in their hair: lice. And believe it or not, those tiny insects may hold the secret to when humans first started wearing clothes. Imagine waking up on a cold winter morning. Now imagine that same cold, but much worse. No heated homes, no warm blankets, no insulated jackets, no boots, and no way to escape the freezing wind. This was the reality faced by many early humans as the Earth entered long periods of colder climate. When most people think of the Ice Age, they imagine a world completely covered in snow. The reality was more complex. Some regions were buried beneath massive sheets of ice, while others became cold, dry grasslands stretching for hundreds of miles. For humans, these new environments created a serious challenge. Their bodies were no longer covered with thick fur, and unlike animals such as mammoth or woolly rhinos, humans had very little natural protection against extreme cold. At first, people relied on simple solutions. They stayed close to fires. They built temporary shelters. They gathered together for warmth. These methods helped, but they were not enough. A fire could keep you warm at night, but what happened when you needed to travel? What happened when hunting required hours of movement through freezing landscapes? The cold followed everywhere, and cold was more than uncomfortable. It was deadly. A single freezing night could weaken the body. Long exposure could lead to illness or death. Children and older adults were especially vulnerable. For early humans, surviving winter became one of the greatest challenges of life. But humans possessed something many animals lacked: creativity. Instead of evolving thicker fur, humans began changing their environment. They learned to use what was already around them: animal hides. After a successful hunt, the skin of an animal could provide protection from wind and cold. At first, these hides were probably worn in very simple ways: wrapped around the shoulders, draped over the body, or tied using strips of leather. They were not fashionable. They were not comfortable, but they worked. And sometimes that's all that matters. For the first time, humans could carry warmth with them. They were no longer completely dependent on fire or shelter. This small change had enormous consequences. Places that once seemed impossible to live in suddenly became accessible. Humans could travel farther, stay longer, and survive harsher climates than ever before. What began as a simple survival tool would eventually transform the future of our species. But here's the fascinating part. Scientists still don't know exactly when humans first started wearing clothes, because unlike stone tools, clothing rarely survives for thousands of years. So how did researchers solve the mystery? Surprisingly, the answer came from one of humanity's oldest companions. Not dogs, not horses, but lice. Minnie Hook, a tiny parasite, would reveal a secret hidden for tens of thousands of years and completely change what scientists thought they knew about the history of clothing. If archaeologists discover an ancient spear, they can study it. If they find an old bone, they can examine it. But clothing creates a unique problem. Most clothing is made from materials that decay over time. Animal skins rot. Plant fibers break down. Fabric disappears. After tens of thousands of years, very little remains. So how can scientists determine when humans first started wearing clothes? The answer comes from an unexpected source. Lice. Yes, the tiny insects that nobody wants in their hair. For thousands of years, lice have lived alongside humans. They survive by feeding on human blood and spending most of their lives on the body. But there are different types of human lice. Head lice live in hair. Body lice live in clothing. And this distinction became incredibly important. Scientists realized something fascinating. Body lice cannot survive without clothing. They depend on fabric and seams to lay eggs and complete their life cycle. Without clothing, body lice simply wouldn't exist. This raised an important question. When did body lice first appear? To find the answer, researchers studied the DNA of lice. By comparing the genetic differences between head lice and body lice, they could estimate when the two groups split apart. The results were surprising. Evidence suggested that body lice evolved from head lice, roughly 170,000 years ago. This means humans were likely wearing some form of clothing at least that long ago. Suddenly, scientists had a new clue. Not from ancient garments, not from archaeological sites, but from parasites. Tiny insects had preserved a chapter of human history that clothing itself could not. Of course, this doesn't mean people were wearing shirts and pants like we do today. The earliest clothing was probably very simple. Animal hides draped over the body. Basic coverings designed for warmth and protection. Nothing fashionable. Nothing elaborate. Just practical tools for survival. Still, the discovery changed how researchers think about early humans. It suggested that clothing appeared much earlier than many people once believed, and it may have played a crucial role in helping humans spread into colder parts of the world. Without clothing, many regions would have been nearly impossible to inhabit. With clothing, new opportunities opened up, new lands, new resources, and new adventures. The story of clothing was becoming much bigger than anyone expected. It wasn't just about staying warm. It was about expanding the limits of where humans could live. But wearing an animal hide is one thing. Turning it into useful, comfortable clothing is something else entirely. And that required one of the most important inventions in human history, the sewing needle. Imagine trying to survive an ice age, winter while wearing nothing more than a loose animal skin draped over your shoulders. At first it might seem good enough, but then the wind begins to blow. Cold air slips through every opening. The hide shifts as you walk. and suddenly staying warm becomes much more difficult. Early humans quickly discovered that simply wrapping themselves in animal skins wasn't the perfect solution. They needed clothing that actually fit the body, clothing that stayed in place while hunting, gathering food, and traveling long distances. And solving that problem required a remarkable invention: the sewing needle. Today, a needle seems ordinary. Most people barely think about it. Yet thousands of years ago, it was a technological breakthrough. Archaeologists have discovered ancient needles made from bone, ivory, and animal antlers. Some of these tools are more than 40,000 years old. What's remarkable is how sophisticated they were. Many had carefully carved eyes just like modern needles. This allowed early humans to thread animal sinew through them. Sinew is a tough material found in animal tendons. It worked surprisingly well as prehistoric thread. With needles and thread, people could finally join pieces of hide together. Instead of wearing a loose skin, they could create fitted garments, sleeves, leg coverings, simple shoes, and clothing designed specifically for different environments. This may not sound revolutionary, but it changed everything. Better clothing meant better protection from the cold. Better protection meant higher survival rates. And higher survival rates allowed humans to expand into regions that were once too harsh to inhabit. Some researchers believe tailored clothing played a major role in humanity's spread across Europe and northern Asia. Without it, many of these areas would have remained extremely dangerous. The sewing needle was small, easy to overlook, yet its impact was enormous. It transformed animal hides from simple coverings into true clothing, and in doing so, it helped humans adapt to some of the harshest environments on Earth. What's fascinating is that this invention required planning and skill. Creating a needle wasn't easy. It had to be shaped carefully. The eye had to be carved precisely, and the finished tool had to be strong enough to survive repeated use. This wasn't the work of primitive people stumbling through life. It was evidence of intelligence, creativity, and problem-solving. The more scientists learn about early humans, the clearer one thing becomes. They were far more capable than many people imagine. But even the best clothing needed one thing above all else: the right material. And no material was more important to early humans than animal hides. Long before cotton shirts, wool sweaters, or synthetic fabrics, humans relied on a single resource for survival: animal hides. For tens of thousands of years, they were among the most valuable materials on Earth. Not gold, not silver, not precious stones. Animal skins, because in many environments, a good hide could mean the difference between life and death. Imagine a group of hunters successfully bringing down a large animal. To modern people, the meat might seem like the most important reward, and it certainly was valuable. But early humans understood something else. The skin was valuable too, very valuable. A single hide could provide warmth, protection, and shelter. Nothing could be wasted. After a hunt, people carefully removed the skin and began preparing it for use. But this was not a simple process. Fresh animal hides quickly become stiff and brittle. If left untreated, they can rot, they can crack, and they become uncomfortable to wear. Early humans had to learn how to preserve them. Over time, they developed techniques that would eventually become known as tanning. Some groups used animal brains, Others used smoke from fires. Some used fats and oils. These methods helped soften the hide and make it more durable. The process required patience and experience. A poorly prepared hide might fall apart. A well-prepared one could last for years. Different animals provided different benefits. Deer hides were soft and flexible. Reindeer hides offered excellent insulation. Large animals, such as bison, provided thick, durable coverings. People learned which materials worked best for different purposes. And slowly, clothing became more advanced. What began as simple protection evolved into carefully crafted garments. Humans were no longer just surviving in cold environments. They were adapting to them. This knowledge spread from generation to generation. Parents taught children. Hunters shared techniques. Entire communities depended on these skills. Without properly prepared hides, many groups could not have survived harsh winters, and the impact went beyond clothing. Animal hides were also used for shelters, blankets, bags, and countless everyday tools. They became one of the foundations of early human life. Looking back, it's easy to underestimate their importance. But before factories and textile mills existed, animal hides were among the most useful resources available. They helped humans endure extreme climates. They made long journeys possible, and they allowed our ancestors to live in places that once seemed impossible. But clothing was about to become much more than survival, because at some point, humans started decorating what they wore, and that marked the beginning of something entirely new: fashion. For thousands of years, clothing had one primary purpose: survival. It protected people from cold temperatures, harsh winds, rain, and snow. But eventually something interesting happened. Humans began wearing clothes for reasons that had nothing to do with staying warm. They started caring about appearance. At first, the changes were small: a decorative shell attached to a garment, a colorful feather placed in a headdress, a piece of jewelry made from bone or stone. These additions didn't make clothing warmer. They didn't improve survival. Yet people continued using them. Why? Because clothing had become a way to communicate. Long before written language existed, what a person wore could send a message. It could show status, experience, achievement, or membership in a particular group. Imagine meeting a stranger thousands of years ago. You don't speak the same language, but you notice the animal teeth hanging around their neck, the carefully decorated clothing, the rare materials they carry. Without saying a word, you've already learned something about them. Anthropologists believe this was one of the earliest forms of social signaling. Clothing was no longer just protection. It had become identity. As human societies grew more complex, this trend continued. Certain materials became symbols of importance. Rare animal furs were often associated with prestige. Decorative beads required time and skill to produce. The more difficult an item was to obtain, the more valuable it became. In a way, fashion was born from human psychology. People wanted to express who they were. They wanted recognition. They wanted to belong. And clothing became one of the easiest ways to do that. This behavior is still with us today. Think about modern brands, uniforms, luxury clothing, sports jerseys, business suits. All of them communicate information before a single word is spoken. The details may have changed, but the basic idea remains the same. Clothing tells a story. What's fascinating is that this shift likely happened much earlier than most people realize. Even prehistoric humans were decorating themselves, not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. That desire transformed clothing forever. What began as a tool for survival became something much bigger, a form of self-expression, a symbol of identity, and eventually an entire industry. But while some people used clothing to express themselves, others used it to display power. And nowhere was that more visible than in one of history's greatest civilizations, ancient Egypt. By the time ancient Egypt emerged along the banks of the Nile, clothing had become far more than a tool for survival. The Egyptians lived in a hot climate where heavy animal furs were unnecessary. Instead, they developed clothing that was lightweight, comfortable, and suited to the intense heat of the desert. One material became especially important: linen. Made from the flax plant, linen was breathable and surprisingly durable. For thousands of years, it became the fabric of Egyptian life. Farmers wore simple linen garments while working in the fields. Craftsmen wore practical clothing suited to their trades. But the wealthier a person became, the more elaborate their clothing often appeared. In ancient Egypt, clothing could reveal social status almost instantly. A poor farmer and a powerful official might wear garments made from the same basic material. Yet the quality, decoration, and craftsmanship could be completely different. The finest linen was incredibly soft and required significant skill to produce. As a result, luxurious clothing became a symbol of wealth and influence. Jewelry played an important role as well. Gold necklaces, decorated bracelets, precious stones. These items transformed simple clothing into displays of power. For the ruling class, appearance mattered. Pharaohs often wore elaborate, ceremonial garments designed to emphasize their authority. Their clothing wasn't just fashion. It was political symbolism. The message was clear. This person stood above everyone else. Religion also influenced Egyptian clothing. Priests frequently wore specific garments during rituals and ceremonies. Certain styles became associated with spiritual authority. Even in death, clothing remained important. Egyptians believed the afterlife was a continuation of existence. As a result, many people were buried with carefully prepared garments and personal belongings. Some tombs contain astonishingly preserved examples of ancient textiles. These discoveries have helped historians understand how Egyptians lived thousands of years ago. What's fascinating is that many modern ideas about clothing were already visible in ancient Egypt. Status, identity, beauty, authority, all expressed through what people wore. Clothing had evolved far beyond survival. It had become a language of its own, a way to communicate without speaking. And as civilizations grew larger and more powerful, that language would become even more complex. But while the Egyptians valued elegance and status, two other civilizations would take clothing in a very different direction. The Greeks and Romans turned clothing into a symbol of citizenship, culture, and power. When most people imagine ancient Greece or Rome, they often picture grand temples, powerful armies, and famous philosophers. But clothing played a surprisingly important role in both civilizations. Unlike the heavily tailored clothing common today, many Greeks preferred simple garments made from large pieces of fabric. One of the most common was the chiton, a rectangular piece of cloth wrapped around the body and secured with pins or belts. It was practical, comfortable, and well suited to the Mediterranean climate. To modern eyes, it might seem simple, but even simple clothing could communicate important information. The quality of the fabric mattered, the color mattered, and the way it was worn mattered. In ancient Greece, appearance reflected social expectations. Citizens were expected to present themselves in a respectable manner. Clothing became part of public life. Rome took these ideas even further. Perhaps no garment is more famous than the Roman toga. Large, heavy, and often difficult to wear, the toga became a symbol of Roman citizenship. Not everyone could wear one. In many cases, the toga represented privilege and status. The larger and more elegant the garment, the more impressive the appearance. Roman society placed enormous importance on visual symbols. Senators wore specific styles. Military leaders had distinctive uniforms. Emperors dressed in ways that emphasized authority and power. A person's clothing could reveal their rank before they even spoke. Color also became important. Certain dyes were extremely expensive. One famous example was Tyrian purple. Producing this color required enormous effort, making it one of the most valuable dyes in the ancient world. As a result, purple clothing became strongly associated with wealth and power. For many people, wearing it was restricted or even forbidden. The message was simple. Some clothes were not meant for everyone. As trade expanded across the Roman Empire, new fabrics and styles appeared. Silk from Asia fascinated wealthy Romans. Fine textiles became luxury items. Clothing was no longer just about protection or identity. It had become a global business. Goods traveled thousands of miles to satisfy demand. Looking back, it's clear that many modern ideas about fashion already existed. Status, luxury, brand-like recognition, and social influence. The tools were different, but human behavior remained surprisingly familiar. As ancient empires rose and fell, clothing continued to evolve. And during the Middle Ages, what you wore could determine how people treated you, where you worked, and even what laws applied to you. As Europe entered the Middle Ages, clothing became much more than protection from the weather. It became a way to show who you were, your job, your wealth, your social class, and sometimes even your legal rights. In many medieval societies, a person's clothing could reveal their position almost instantly. A poor farmer dressed very differently from a wealthy merchant. A merchant dressed differently from a noble, and a noble dressed differently from a king. In a world where most people could not read, clothing acted like a visual language. It told others where you belonged in society. For ordinary people, clothing was usually simple and practical. Most garments were made from wool or linen. The fabrics were durable, but often rough compared to modern materials. Many families made their own clothing at home. A single outfit might be worn for years before being replaced. Nothing was wasted. Patches were common. Repairs were constant. And every piece of fabric had value. The wealthy lived very differently. Nobles and royalty could afford expensive dyes. imported fabrics, and skilled tailors. Bright colors became symbols of wealth because producing them was often costly. Some garments required weeks or even months of work. The richer the person, the more elaborate the clothing. In some places, governments even passed laws controlling what people could wear. These were known as sumptuary laws. A common citizen might be forbidden from wearing certain colors, fabrics, or decorations reserved for the upper classes. The goal was simple: to make social status visible. Authorities wanted people to know their place in society. Clothing helped maintain that system. Religion also influenced fashion during the Middle Ages. Modesty was often emphasized. Different religious groups developed their own styles of dress. Monks, priests, and nuns could often be recognized instantly by their clothing. Their garments reflected spiritual values rather than wealth. What's fascinating is that clothing had become one of the most powerful symbols in everyday life. It could open doors, create opportunities, or reinforce social barriers. The same basic invention that once helped humans survive the ice age had become a tool for defining identity and status, and its importance would continue to grow. But clothing wasn't only about wealth and social class. For millions of people throughout history, it also became deeply connected to faith, tradition, and cultural identity. As human societies grew larger and more complex, clothing began to serve another purpose beyond warmth, survival, or social status. It became a symbol of belief, a symbol of identity, and in many cases a symbol of belonging. Throughout history, people have used clothing to express who they are and what they believe. Long before national flags became common, clothing often helped identify members of different cultures, communities, and religions. In many ancient societies, religious leaders wore special garments during ceremonies. These clothes were not designed to impress people with wealth. Instead, they represented spiritual authority. Special robes, head coverings, and ceremonial garments became important parts of religious traditions around the world. Over time, certain styles became closely connected with specific beliefs. A person could often be recognized simply by what they wore. This created a powerful sense of identity. When people dressed similarly, they felt connected to one another. They became part of something larger than themselves. Even today, clothing continues to play this role. School uniforms, military uniforms, religious garments, traditional cultural clothing. Each one communicates something important without the need for words. They tell a story about community and belonging. But clothing has also been used to preserve culture. As civilizations changed and empires rose and fell, many groups protected their traditions through dress. Styles passed from parents to children, generation after generation, sometimes surviving for hundreds of years. In many parts of the world, traditional clothing remains an important connection to history. It reminds people where they came from, who their ancestors were, and what values shaped their communities. What's fascinating is that the saying, invention that began as protection against cold weather, eventually became a way to express ideas, beliefs, and identity. A simple animal hide worn for survival had evolved into something far more meaningful. By this point in history, clothing was no longer just something people needed. It had become something people valued, something personal, something powerful, and that importance would grow even more during one of the greatest transformations in human history, the Industrial Revolution. Because for thousands of years making clothing was slow, difficult, and expensive. But that was about to change forever. Machines would soon revolutionize the way clothes were made, making fashion cheaper, faster, and more accessible than ever before. For most of human history, making clothing was a slow and difficult process. Every piece of fabric required time. Every thread required effort. And every garment represented hours, days, or even weeks of work. Before the Industrial Revolution, most clothing was made by hand. People spun fibers into thread. They wove fabric on looms. They cut and stitched garments one piece at a time. As a result, clothing was expensive. Many families owned only a few outfits. People repaired their clothes repeatedly because replacing them was not easy. In some households, garments were passed down from one generation to the next. Nothing went to waste. Then, during the late 1700s and early 1800s, something extraordinary happened. Machines began transforming production. Inventors created new tools that could spin, thread, and weave fabric far faster than human workers. Factories appeared across Europe and later North America. Suddenly, clothing could be produced on a scale never seen before. What once took days could now be done in hours, and what once cost a fortune became affordable for ordinary people. The change was revolutionary. For the first time in history, large numbers of people could own multiple sets of clothing. Fashion was no longer limited to the wealthy. Styles began changing more quickly. New trends appeared. Old trends disappeared. The clothing industry became one of the largest industries in the world. At the same time, global trade expanded. Cotton traveled across oceans. Textiles moved between continents. Factories consumed enormous amounts of raw materials. Clothing was becoming a worldwide business. But these changes also came with challenges. Factory workers often faced long hours and difficult conditions. Children sometimes worked in textile mills. The demand for cheap production created new social problems. The history of clothing was no longer just about survival or identity. It had become connected to economics, industry, and global trade. Yet despite these challenges, the Industrial Revolution permanently changed the relationship between humans and clothing. What was once rare became common. What was once handmade became mass-produced. And what began thousands of years earlier with animal hides and bone needles evolved into a modern industry worth billions of dollars. But even after clothing became easier to produce, the deeper question remained. If survival was no longer the main reason we wore clothes, why do they still matter so much today? If an early human from 100,000 years ago suddenly appeared in the modern world, one thing would probably confuse them more than almost anything else. Not airplanes, not smartphones, not skyscrapers, but closets. Closets filled with dozens of different outfits. Shirts for work, clothes for exercise, formal clothing for special events, winter jackets, summer clothing, and countless styles designed for different situations. To our ancestors, this would seem extraordinary. After all, clothing originally existed for one simple reason: survival. Yet today, Most people wear clothes for many reasons that have little to do with staying alive. Of course, protection still matters. A winter coat protects us from cold temperatures. Work uniforms can provide safety. Specialized clothing helps athletes perform in extreme conditions. But for many people, clothing has become something much more personal. It helps express identity. Think about how much information clothing communicates. Without speaking a word, a person can reveal their profession, interests, culture, or personality. A police officer's uniform sends one message. A doctor's coat sends another. A business suit creates a different impression, and a sports jersey tells its own story. Clothing acts as a form of communication, a silent language understood around the world. Fashion also plays a powerful role. Every year, trends appear and disappear. Styles that once seemed modern become outdated, and older styles often return in new forms. The desire to stand out or sometimes to fit and continues to influence what people wear. In many ways, this behavior isn't new. Ancient Egyptians used clothing to display status. Romans used it to signal citizenship and power. Medieval nobles used it to demonstrate wealth. Humans have been expressing themselves through clothing for thousands of years. Only the styles have changed. Perhaps the most remarkable thing is how far clothing has evolved. From simple animal hides wrapped around the body to advanced fabrics designed by scientists. Some modern materials can resist water. Others can regulate temperature. Some can even monitor health information. The invention that began as protection against the cold continues to evolve today, and it may keep evolving for centuries to come. But before we finish our journey, there's one final question. Was clothing really invented because humans were cold? Or is the true answer far more complicated than that? After exploring thousands of years of human history, we can finally return to the question that started this journey. Why did humans begin wearing clothes? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Because they were cold. And certainly, cold weather played an important role. As humans moved into colder regions, clothing became essential for survival. Without it, many parts of Europe and Asia would have been nearly impossible to inhabit. Animal hides, sewn garments, and improved protection allowed our ancestors to expand into new environments. But the story doesn't end there, because if warmth were the only reason for clothing, human history would look very different. Over time, clothing became much more than protection from the elements. It became a tool for communication, a way to signal status, a symbol of identity, a reflection of culture, and sometimes even a source of power. The evidence from body lice suggests that humans were wearing some form of clothing at least 170,000 years ago. Yet from that point onward, clothing continued evolving, not because humans needed more warmth, but because humans needed meaning. A decorated garment could show skill. A rare fabric could show wealth. A uniform could show authority. And traditional clothing could connect people to their community. In other words, clothing became part of what made us human. Unlike most animals, humans don't simply adapt to their environment. We change it. We create tools. We invent solutions. And clothing may be one of the greatest examples of that ability. A simple animal hide eventually led to one of the largest industries in human history. It influenced trade, culture, technology, religion, and even global exploration. So what is the real reason humans started wearing clothes? The most honest answer is that there wasn't just one reason. It began with survival. It expanded through innovation, and it evolved into identity. Clothing helped humans survive the world. Then it helped humans express themselves within it. And that transformation continues to this day. But before we end, let's take one final look at how a simple invention changed the course of human history forever. Imagine a world where humans never invented clothing. No coats, no shoes, no gloves, no protective layers of any kind. It's difficult to imagine because clothing has become such a normal part of life. Yet without it, human history might have unfolded very differently. Many of the cold regions humans eventually settled would have remained inaccessible. Entire migrations may never have happened. Civilizations could have developed differently, and the world we know today might not exist in the same form. What began as a practical solution became one of humanity's most important inventions. From animal hides and bone needles to modern fabrics and global fashion, clothing has accompanied us through every stage of our journey. It protected explorers, identified cultures, displayed power, expressed creativity, and helped shape civilization itself. The next time you put on a shirt, zip up a jacket, or tie your shoes, remember that you're participating in a tradition that stretches back tens of thousands of years. A tradition born from survival, improved by innovation, and transformed by human imagination. Because clothing isn't just something we wear. It's a story of adaptation, a story of creativity, and ultimately a story of what it means to be human. Thanks for joining this journey through history.